As a designer, I don't look at things through the lens of technology alone. I'm trying to approach this through the eyes of us as humans. And if you caught what I had to say last year, and if not, what I was talking about was the foundation of what forms a healthy relationship between human and machine. And that the foundation of this is purpose, value, and trust. And tonight, what I'm really here to talk about is this aspect here, the trust aspect. So just a quick show of hands, who is currently worried about trust and ethics as it relates to artificial intelligence? Yeah, that's a pretty good number of hands. When I got back from this trip last year, I had people asking me, so the relationship angle is great. When are you going to start talking about ethics? When's the ethics work come? And I said, not me. This isn't my job. I'm a designer. What do I know about ethics? I haven't taken a course in ethics. I'm not an ethicist. And so this woman who is now on my team, Milena Pribich, she calls me up one day and she says, hey, where's the ethics work? And I said, it's not me. She said, well, who do I talk to? I said, well, the head ethicist for AI for IBM, her name is Francesca Rossi. And so she said, thanks. And the next thing I knew, I'm in a meeting with Francesca and Milena, and somehow I've been bamboozled into taking on this position paper for what it means to practice design ethically for artificial intelligence. Again, I said I don't really know what I'm talking about at this point, so this is me. And I'm trying to make sense of all of this, and I have a feeling that most of you are in the same spot because it's something that we're all concerned about. And at the same time, we don't really have a whole lot to go on in terms of getting ourselves smart because we feel like it's outside of our knowledge base. And in one of my first conversations with Francesca, she said something that just put me at ease and sort of took this feeling away. And what she said was that ethics is not about compliance, it's about doing the right thing. And that just made me cool off a little bit, because I at least like to think that I know a little bit about doing the right thing. But it's also not about checking things off a checklist either. It's a lot deeper than that. So in the meantime, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's happening, and this is all coming at us rapid fire, right? So we have Mark Zuckerberg testifying in front of the US Congress about the data scandal with them and Cambridge Analytica, and that they used the Facebook platform to secretly harvest 50 million data user accounts and their data. And this made everybody stop and say, well, hey, wait a minute, we're all on Facebook. We weren't necessarily paying attention that closely. But then we also started seeing that Amazon was selling its facial recognition to law enforcement, that the real killer robots is actually not killer robots, but bias, and that, here we go, that facial recognition systems are even more biased than we thought. And this is coming at us one story after the other. And then this sort of peaks with the Chinese social capital system, in which there are 200 million CCTVs that are recording everybody's behavior and interactions across the country, and that they report on this maybe just a month ago that there are 23 million people that were denied the ability to travel based on their behavior and as it was filtered through artificial intelligence and machine learning. And if you watch Black Mirror, that is the episode Nosedive, where your behavior determines what you're capable of doing. And this should make us all stop and take a breath and say, well, what's really going on and who's really paying attention to this? So we leak more data. We also give it away willingly in return for simple things like discounts on washers and dryers. It's being taken from us, it's being harvested from us, and as a result, we all trust these systems less and less. So how do we preserve our privacy and integrity and our humanity when so much of big data is about turning us into a data point in which we have no humanity? We are simply a figure or a fact. We're losing unique perspective and voices in all of this. And as designers of these things, we're failing When we turn humans into statistics and data points, we have to think larger than this. This is possibly the most important statement that I can make all evening, that ethical decision-making isn't just another form of technical problem-solving. It isn't about agile. It isn't about design thinking. It requires us to think deeply about what we're choosing to bring into being. We say the words artificial intelligence and AI so much that I think oftentimes we forget what we're actually saying. Artificial intelligence. We are bringing an intelligence into this world that did not exist before. This is not like spinning up a database or building a website. We are creating new intelligence, and there is a responsibility that goes with this. So we're responsible for teaching machines what we value. I talked about this last year as well. They must be trained with transparency and trust in mind first, not as an afterthought. And for us to truly trust in a machine, accountability has to be present. We have to be able to understand how a machine gets there, and we have to understand who's responsible for bringing this machine into being. Without this accountability, we're going to have a very difficult time placing our trust into an artificial intelligence. This is why my team created this document here, which is called Everyday Ethics for Artificial Intelligence. The ground truth of these relationships are going to be influenced by those who are responsible for shaping what goes into an artificial intelligence. And to do this with authenticity requires us to be conscious about how we understand ourselves before anything else. So my team focused on these 5 broad areas because what we found was the pieces of work that were out there that related to artificial intelligence and ethics tended to be somewhere around 300 pages. And that would require me or a team member to go home, read all 300 pages of this, somehow take it into my heart, show up to work the next day or after the weekend, and say, this is the way I'm going to work, this is the way I'm going to think about what I'm doing, and I have to assume that every single team member has done the same thing. And it's just not realistic. We expect too much and we move too fast to spend that much time with it. So rather than get into all of the nitty-gritty, what we decided to do was to take the 5 most important things and put them in front of people in a way that they could easily understand. So it wasn't 300 pages, but it was about 15 pages, and that you could read this in about 30 minutes, and I could stand up here and talk to you about this in about 30 minutes, and explain the basics of it so that it makes sense, common sense, so that we can talk to each other about this, ask each other some questions that raises our awareness, and then we can have a real discussion about whether or not what it is that we choose to do is the right thing to do, or if we need to adjust what we choose to do based on what we discover about ourselves through our own work. So I'm going to go through those 5 focus areas. The first is accountability, and this is agnostic of role. It doesn't matter if you're a data scientist, a designer, an engineer, it does not matter. Every person involved in the creation of an AI at any step is accountable for considering the system's impact in the world. So this is a quote from an article about a lawsuit filed on behalf of disabled individuals against Idaho's state health insurance program around algorithmic bias. And I'm going to read this to you. So it was a lack of understanding of the process on the part of everybody. Everybody assumed somebody else knew how it worked. When it started delivering biased results, they started interviewing all the different team members, that they found out that the data set was flawed and corrupt, that they only used a subset of the data, that there were fundamental statistical flaws in how the algorithm was structured, and during questioning, everyone involved answered, I don't know that, but this other person does. We have to hold ourselves to a higher standard. We cannot play this game when we talk about doing this. We have a basic exercise that we run through that is a little bit of a crystal ball exercise, but allows us to forecast it. We call it layers of effect. It's pretty easy to do. It can take you about 15 minutes. You could spend all day doing it if you wanted to. But here, simply put, the primary layer of effect is what you set out to do. It's what's on the face of the tin. It's why you choose to do this work. It's the main benefit of your product or your service or your offering. The secondary might not pop up until after you take this to market and people start using it. Secondary is additional benefits that come that you didn't plan for, but you take advantage of after the fact. And tertiary are almost always negative. They're the things that we didn't think about, that they don't necessarily happen intentionally, but they happen unintentionally. And then you have to dig yourself out of a hole. And when we talk about it in terms of a website, like in this case, Yelp, it's not necessarily the end of the world because the artificial intelligence isn't being affected by it here. So in this case, just to make the point, if we're talking about Yelp, the primary reason is that we want to make a community for people who like to write reviews of restaurants and people who like to read reviews of restaurants. Pretty simple and straightforward. This is how Yelp starts out. Yelp gets going, the community builds up. What happens next? Now we have affiliate revenue through things like OpenTable. We have self-service tools for businesses. We have reservation services, all these things that they can make money on that they didn't necessarily plan for when they were doing the original idea. And then after that comes the tertiary level where you have trolling of establishments, you have campaigns that are negatively affecting other establishments based on competition, you have political targeting of restaurants. I don't know if you saw the whole thing about Pizzagate in the United States. That pizza restaurant is literally at the end of my block. You have fake accounts, harassment of users between each other online. These are things that they didn't stop to think about, but they were things that they had to deal with. As a website and a community, it's one thing. If it's an artificial intelligence that's taking on bias, that's taking on other users' information, that's doing something with it and taking action on it, it gets a lot more difficult to back that out. Second one is value alignment. So AI should be designed to align with the norms and values of the users that you have in mind that you're going to serve. This is probably the single greatest failure point that I find with most of the teams that I work with, is that they don't actually understand what their own values are, let alone the values of the people that they're designing it for. And last year I talked about this AI ecosystem in which most of the time we talk about the machine by itself, and the machine by itself is just an empty glass until we fill it up with what the business needs are, the human needs are, and the data that represents the world. The machine doesn't really have anything to do, but most importantly, it's this context between these four elements that makes the machine what it is. And this machine can't gain this context without human intervention. We have to provide it. But there's a wider context when we're talking about ethics, right? We have to think about how this fits in with our community. We have to think about how it fits in the business arena. We have to think about how it sits with organizations and within the public sector, and how everybody takes this on, chooses to use it, because we don't do these things in a vacuum. We don't use these tools in a vacuum. This happens as a part of a larger society. And each culture has slightly different, sometimes widely different value systems. So that means if there's a boatload of people who are making artificial intelligence in North America and make it North America centric, it may not work for this culture. Likewise, we have differences between Chinese, Japanese, Southeast Asia. We have different value systems, and we can't just build one and say, okay, well, the intelligence will figure the rest of it out. Values are deeply seated inside of us. So we start with something basic out of design thinking. We do an empathy map. This is how we actually understand the people who are going to use it and all the different people who will take advantage of this. And that helps us understand what they'll say, think, do, or feel. And there's no replacing primary user research, but this is a good way to start getting your head around what is it that people are doing and feeling and acting in their daily lives, independent of the tool, so that we understand them as people and not as a data point. The larger question is, how do we adjust an AI's values as our community's value changes and evolves over time? Because this means we have to retrain. We have to tell somebody that something, or tell the machine, that something that was acceptable 6 months ago or a year ago or a decade ago is no longer acceptable by our societal standards. So this is why we recommend doing an ethics canvas, and this is something that we did not develop, but this is one of those things where it's way better not to reinvent the wheel. So this is based on a business model canvas, and you can find it at ethicscanvas.org. They actually have tools that are there. The idea behind this is that you're thinking about all of these different aspects that make up what what creates our value system, and that you keep this live and you update it as things change, as your machine grows and as your user base grows. And this is really important, because if we don't do this, we're not doing it with intention. And if we don't do this with intention, then we're letting the chips fall where they fall. And that is not good enough when we're talking about artificial intelligence. 3 is explainability. So AI should be designed for humans to easily perceive, detect, and understand its decision process. And that is so easy to say and much more difficult, as we're finding, to actually do. And I'm ad-libbing here at this point, but I was in the audience at a different conference, and there was a panel going on, and they were talking about transparency and explainability. And 3 experts were up on the stage, and somebody stood up and they said, so how can you explain your own thought process? And at the very best, it's fuzzy. And I was like, for once, I'm so glad that I'm not the one up on stage. So explainability looks a little bit like this. You know, there's this black box, and we think, you know, the general public thinks like, well, there's some input. It goes into the black box, magic, and then output, right? I mean, that's how AI works, right? You know, this isn't the way it works, although sometimes even for those of us who are working on it, it might feel like that, because you can't get in there and see how it got to the answer. So the reality of this is that it's our responsibility to understand how this is going on, what's happening inside of that black box. And as it turns out, this is a lot more difficult than anybody had imagined. And of course, everybody involved in this who's doing anything responsible around this technology, whether it's our company or others, are doing their very best to get at the answer for this, but it is still on the way, which is why we need you to be aware of this so that you can contribute to this cause as well. In this case, you know, if it was working, you know, a machine might make a suggestion on maybe how to get somewhere, get to work, and we, on the simple end, because users don't care how it's built or what's going on behind the scenes, they just want it to work whatever it is. And we should be able to say, like, what'd you do there? And it should be able to give us a very clear answer of, like, I looked at all these different data points, and I was looking at, you were running late today, and so I made these suggestions, but we're not there yet. Something that we have been thinking about was that there's no consistent and agreed upon way for AI services to be created, tested, trained, deployed, and evaluated. There's no standards for this. We all do it differently. And so some folks in IBM research have proposed this idea called AI fact sheets. And of course, this is BS because we're still figuring out what it is. But the idea, at least that image is, not the idea. The idea behind this is, in the same way that we have no problem just picking up a package of food and looking at the nutrition label and understanding what's in there, even if you don't understand what polysaturated something or other is as a chemical, you understand what's in the food that you're buying. Think of this like a nutritional label for AI, so that you have things like what category is it in, what's the purpose of this, what are the data sources, are there, you know, what's the level of bias, are there risks and potential biases in there? So this way, we would all be able to look and see what's inside of an AI. So we're working on this. Hopefully we'll have something to show in the near future around this. 4 is fairness. AI has to be designed to minimize bias and promote inclusive representation. So we have to minimize this algorithmic bias, which is through ongoing research and data collection that's representative of a diverse population. There are about 180 forms of implicit and unconscious bias from humans alone that are defined and classified. We took on like the top 15 here. You can go find the others if you'd like. The point being is that these easily find their way into our systems, and it gets into the process well before we actually start building the AI, because it starts here with us as the humans. And so that means if your user group looks like this, and your team looks like this, you're starting from behind the 8 ball. It's very difficult. You're already at a disadvantage. So fairness is equal representation of people who are feeding the machine, training the machine, and working on the machine. But it is not equal representation alone that matters. It is that there is also equal participation. So you can say that you have a diverse team, but if only 3 people are working on this, it doesn't really matter. It's a nice soundbite, it's a nice thing to say, but it's not truly fair. So you have to make sure that the people who are involved are diverse, that they are empowered, and that they do have the will and the capability to participate in what it is that you're doing. Number 5, the last one, user data rights. AI must be designed to protect user data and perceive the user's control over access and uses. So when we separate someone from their identity, control shifts from the human to the technology. And this is not healthy, right? Because this is what makes us as a human become a data point, and we lose ourselves in the process. So this isn't about necessarily getting rid of data, but it's about being respectful of people and being mindful about this process. And really, it's about making this relationship symbiotic. And I talked about this last year too, is that we have to augment the machine before the machine can augment ourselves. And that means that we have to be thinking very deeply about what types of data we're using and what it means and how we're filtering it through the algorithms that we choose. So the EU, they have GDPR. You know, it aims to primarily give control to individuals over their personal data and to simplify that regulatory environment that puts this all within their power. Here, you have the New Zealand Privacy Act of 1993, which is quite robust, but the thing that I found when I was doing research about this is that there's no general right to privacy in New Zealand law. Privacy tends to hold the status of a value or an interest rather than a right. This is not necessarily ideal, but if you overlap this on top of GDPR, it does stand up very well. And the point being is if you are working on AI and you are talking about collecting data or doing something with data that your machine can put together, you need to be acutely aware of what these principles mean for you and how you're going about doing the work that you're doing. So you got to be mindful of the types of data that we collect, the reasons that we need this data, and how it can empower or restrict people. We need to be very mindful of this. So those are the 5 focus areas. Hopefully this will allow you to start thinking intentionally about the health of your entire model. If we ingrain ethics in the process, the trust building will lead to a willingness to participate that's integral to the success of any AI effort. And to that end, we've made this publicly available. You can get it at this address. Every single thing that my team will create around ethics is going to be freely available. There is no such thing as proprietary thought when it comes to the ethics behind AI. We invite you to read this, to give us feedback, and to contribute to this. There can't be enough voices and brains thinking about what this means to us. Like I said at the beginning, I am by no means an expert on this. I do have the benefit of working with some of the smartest people in the world on these topics, but you need to factor into this as well, and we need everybody possible to be contributing to an effort that goes towards ethics. I showed this last year too, and it's just as relevant, and it's slightly less playful than it was last year, but it still means the same thing, that this is the way that you need to think about your AI. You are the parents of a toddler. They are not born as PhDs. It takes a while to get them there. We talk about this in terms of what they actually know, but it also has to consider what they do as far as they behave, how they treat one another, how they treat us. This is very important. And if you hold this in your heart and in your head, it will help you do the right thing too. Thank you very much.